Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today at this important conference regarding scientific evidence and legal procedures involving children and families. So today, my topic, as you can see, is misinformation echo chamber, false statements about parental alienation theory. So I'm going to explain to you in a few minutes what that means, what misinformation echo chamber means. But first, we need to say a few words of introduction. So, as you know, my name is Dr. Bill Barnett, and I am a child psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States. So I want to make sure that you know what's happening today. Today is Parental Alienation Awareness Day, which is an international event that's celebrated in many countries, including, I believe, in Latin America. So there's a poster that was created each year. A colleague of ours, whose name is Ricardo Simoes, who I think is in Portugal, creates a poster celebrating International Parental Alienation Awareness Day. So this is the poster that came out this year. So let's look at this, although I have to say this poster is a little bit gruesome, because this is a hand that I think is bloody, and it's holding a child who is like a puppet. And down below, those red lines, I think, are supposed to be blood dripping from this hand. So yes, this is pretty gruesome. But up top, there are these strings, and there are some scissors that are cutting the strings of the child who is a puppet. So somebody is trying to rescue this child. The writing down below, I can show you what that says. Those are actually the names of the different organizations that have endorsed this poster this year. And some of them are familiar. There's an organization called Al-Kappa, which is in France, and a global organization, Global Action for Research Integrity and Parental Alienation, which is in Mexico, and some other organizations that you might recognize. So anyway, I just want to wish you a happy Parental Alienation Awareness Day. This is what I want to cover today. I'm going to talk about misstatements or misinformation regarding parental alienation theory. And I'm going to give you several examples of what I mean by misinformation. And then I want to tell you about some research. My colleagues and I have done some pretty detailed research on a particular aspect of misinformation regarding parental alienation that I'm going to tell you about. And also, I want to talk about what we can do about this. Is there something we can do to address and contradict misinformation and to help us all have a better understanding of this topic? So here are several examples. Oh, actually, first of all, let's make sure we all have the same definitions. Let's read this together. Parental alienation is a mental condition of a child, usually a child whose parents are engaged in a high conflict separation or divorce, and the child allies strongly with one parent, the favored parent, and rejects a relationship with the other parent, the alienated parent, without a good reason. So a lot of people like to see this in the form of a diagram. And in this diagram, you can see at the top, there's an alienating parent and an alienated parent, and they are in conflict, and they blame each other for what's happening with the child. And this yellow squiggle is what we mean by parental alienation. In other words, it's the mental state of the child in which the child has false information about one of the parents, And it's also the child's rejection of the alienated parent is what we call parental alienation. But over here on the other side, the big red arrow is what we call alienating behaviors. So what happens, the general process of what happens is that the alienating parent exhibits a number of alienating behaviors that influence the child to reject the alienated parent. Most of us understand that. That's been the definition that we've used for many years of parental alienation and alienating behaviors. So, ever since parental alienation was introduced in 1985 by a child psychiatrist named Richard Gardner, there has been a lot of misinformation and misstatements and false information about parental alienation theory. This has happened much more than what usually happens in psychological theories, that this misinformation has come up over and over again in different forms. And here are a couple of examples. So here's an article that appeared in an important journal in forensic psychiatry, the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. And an article appeared in this journal that was problematic. And this is the article. The name of it was "The Parental Alienation Debate Belongs in the Courtroom, Not in DSM-5." In other words, at that time, my colleagues and I were trying to get parental alienation into the diagnostic manual, both the DSM and also the ICD. That is, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders published by the American Psychiatric Association. And the ICD, of course, is the Handbook of Diagnoses published by the World Health Organization. So we were trying to get parental alienation into DSM-5, and these are some people who wrote an article disagreeing with us. And we responded to this one, and this one we were able to write our own article. Dr. Amy Baker and I wrote another article in the same journal a couple of months later, in which we were able to respond to the article by the critics. So that's one example. In other words, when misinformation happens, that's one solution that might help clear up the misinformation. So here's another example. This is a book that was published several years ago. It's called Family Evaluation in Custody Litigation. And this is an important book. It was published by the American Psychological Association. And this book had a number of mistakes in it regarding parental alienation theory. So in this case, we complained to the authors of the book. They're listed here. Their names were Benjamin, Beck, Shaw, and Geffner. We complained to the authors, but we also complained to the people who edited and published the book. This book was published by a big organization, the American Psychological Association, and we wrote to them, and we wrote to the senior people in that organization, and we were somewhat successful in that they corrected the book. Actually, what they corrected the online version, the digital version of the book, and they said that when they did another printing, they would correct the hard copy version of the book. So that was somewhat successful. Here's another example of misinformation. This is a journal that's a pretty good journal called Children and Youth Services Review. And it published an article a couple of years ago in which it had an error in only one or two sentences. The whole article was actually pretty good, but it had a very small error in one sentence. And we sent in a correction. The authors agreed to it, and they corrected it. That article now, if you look at online, you'll see the corrected version. So that was successful correction of misinformation. Here's another one. This is an important journal in the United States called Family Court Review. which is the journal of AFCC, the Journal of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. So they've had several articles that had misinformation in it. And they also agreed that they said if I wanted to send in a new article, they would have published it in which I tried to clear up the misinformation. So that I haven't done that yet, but if I get around to it, I'm going to try to publish a new article in that journal. So that was somewhat successful. So here's an example that we were not successful. Here's an article that was published in a journal called the Journal of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers a few years ago. And the name of the article was Under the Microscope, the Admissibility of Parental Alienation Syndrome. That article had many, many mistakes. In fact, the premise of the entire article was a misunderstanding or misinformation regarding parental alienation theory. So in this case, I wrote to the author, I wrote to the editor of the journal. We had several correspondents, but they never agreed to do anything. The journal is still there. This article is still there. They did not do any kind of correction. So that did not work out. So my idea here is that sometimes it's possible to make corrections in misinformation, but not always. Here's one more example. This was a document published by the United Nations. It's actually by a component of the United Nations called the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And they published this document about a year ago called Custody, Violence Against Women and Violence Against Children. This document, this was a report that originally apparently was supposed to be about domestic violence. And everybody, of course, disapproves of domestic violence. So that seems like a good topic. However, what happened is when the report came out, the report almost completely was a discussion of parental alienation theory. And there were many, many false statements regarding parental alienation theory in this document. We were very concerned because this was published by the United Nations. So we wrote a correction. My colleagues and I wrote another document in which we tried to point out all the errors in the document from the United Nations. And we sent it to many countries. We sent it to all the countries that were represented on the Human Rights Council. We sent it to other people in Mexico and in the United States. I guess you would say we were 1/2 successful. That document still exists, and it is still on the website of the United Nations. However, the Human Rights Council never officially adopted or endorsed or accepted that document. So perhaps we were somewhat successful in that we made it so that the document was not officially adopted by the Human Rights Council. So maybe we were 50% successful, but the document is still up there on the United Nations website. This has been going on for a long time. These statements about parental alienation and having to correct them over and over again. In fact, this is an important article about misinformation by Richard Gardner. I think I mentioned already that Dr. Gardner is the person who introduced the term parental alienation syndrome in 1985. So after he did that, there was many things said about him that were incorrect. And there were many things said about parental alienation that were incorrect. So this is an article that he wrote in which he attempted to correct some of this information. Just I'll just give you one example from this article, that some people had said that Richard Gardner was a supporter or a advocate of pedophilia. Well, that is totally false. That Dr. Gardner was never an advocate of pedophilia. And in fact, in this article, he tried to refute that misinformation. And one of the things he said was it was his opinion that pedophiles should be in prison. So that's a simple example of a misstatement, of a false statement that it was stated over and over again. And sometimes that's still said, but that is a false statement that is used by people who don't want us to use parental alienation theory. There are people who are trying to suppress or eliminate parental alienation theory, and they make many false statements. So my colleagues and I have done some research on this topic, and I want to tell you about our specific research. This is the article that we published. This is an important journal in forensic sciences, behavioral sciences, and the law. And our article is the cover story of this issue. Now, if you look over here at this cover, you'll see these blue circles and some lines and so on. And I think you might think this is a very confusing picture, and it is. In fact, we did this on purpose. We put an image on the cover of the journal to be a little confusing because we wanted people to open up the journal and read our article. So I have to admit that we were successful and that we got our article advertised on the cover of the journal. This is the name of the article from a couple years ago. Scholarly Rumors, Citation Analysis of Vast Misinformation Regarding Parental Alienation Theory. And this was written by myself and by Dr. Shenming Zhu, who is a person at Vanderbilt. She's a doctor at Vanderbilt University, who is an expert in the display of data. She is an expert on how to display complicated data from research for use in articles and presentations. And so this is what our article was about. Our article is about misinformation about parental alienation. But we studied a number of different journals, and the thing that we discovered is that there is the same misinformation stated over and over again, many, many times. And that's what we wanted to write our article about, was the same misinformation. And this is, and let's read this together. This is the false information that has been published many times. Parental alienation theory assumes that the favored parent has caused parental alienation in the child simply because the child refuses to have a relationship with the rejected parent without identifying or proving alienating behaviors by the favored parent. That is a false piece of information. In other words, these people are saying that we assume that every time a child rejects a parent, it's because they were indoctrinated by the alienating parent or the favored parent. In other words, this is false statement. They're saying that every time we see contact refusal, we conclude automatically, or we assume that that's caused by alienating behaviors. And we do not say that at all. That is a false statement regarding parental alienation theory. And this is the true information. What we would say is there are many possible reasons for a child's contact refusal or a parent-child contact problem, and that parental alienation is only one of many possibilities. So do you see the difference here? The false information says that we assume that every single example of contact refusal is caused by parental alienation. The true information is that there are many reasons why a child might have contact refusal, and parental alienation is only one of those, and a person would have to do a very good evaluation to try to figure out the exact cause of the contact refusal. So Dr. Zhu and I, my colleague and I, discovered that this false information was stated over and over and over again, many, many times in psychology journals and in legal journals. And we made a long list, and this is what we found out. See all these circles? Each circle is an example of a journal article that has this false information, and it has the name of the author and the date, the year that it was published. And actually, there are 94 examples here on this chart, and they're chronological. In other words, way down on the left-hand side, it says Wood, 1994, and that was the very first one. And way over on the right-hand side, it has articles or book chapters from 2022. So this is a chronological display. Also, each of these journal articles were quoted subsequently by other articles, and the size of the circle shows something. The size of the circle shows how many times that article was quoted later in subsequent years. For instance, see that big circle at the top? It says Brooke, 2001. That was an article by a law professor named Brooke, and it's a large circle because that particular article was quoted many, many times later. So here's a diagram. So this is the same picture with further explanation. See all these lines? These lines indicate which articles quoted which articles. Each of those lines is actually a little arrow, and you can see going from one circle to another, it's a little arrow showing that so-and-so was quoted by other people. So as you can see, there's lots and lots of people quoting each other, and that's why the same information was published over and over and over again. This has a name. The name of this kind of study is called citation analysis. In other words, this chart has 94 citations on it, or references, and the analysis is how they're related to each other, and that each one is the model for other ones that come later. And there are 94 citations here, but there are hundreds of references back and forth. So that's what we did in our research. And this is a very dramatic portrayal of the perpetration of the same misinformation. And I guess you would say the perpetuation of the same misinformation. Let's look at this a little bit closer. If you go look at the left-hand side, which it says Wood, that's where all this started. It started in 1994. This woman named Wood was a law student at a university in California in a law school, and she's the first person who wrote an article and published it in her law school review journal that law students put together. And it was published, and she was copied by several other people. And you can see from the arrows, but this is where it all started. And as you can see, since she was the very first one, she only has outgoing arrows because other people referenced her, but she didn't reference anybody else. She was the beginning. So she only has outgoing arrows. If you look way over on the right-hand side of the same chart, this is the current time. In other words, this is where this process has continued up until the present time. And the most recent ones are in the year 2022, which was a book that was published a couple of years ago. So in this case, you can see that these are much smaller circles because they don't have any outgoing arrows because they're brand new, but they do have incoming arrows. So in other words, these several examples quoted previously published material, but they haven't yet been quoted by other people. So anyway, that's how this whole diagram works. And this was published, this article, as I told you, was the cover story of a journal published about a year and a half ago. So after that, we continued with this research, and we have continued to dig deeper and study additional examples. And I'm still talking, by the way, not just about all different types of misinformation. I'm talking about the same misinformation in which critics of parental alienation say that we think falsely that every example of contact refusal is caused by an alienating parent. We don't think that. That is not part of parental alienation theory, but people keep saying that about us over and over again. And that's not helpful. That's destructive to parental alienation theory. So here's the new article that Dr. Zhu and I have produced. This is actually the same, this is the title of this talk, Misinformation Echo Chamber. Parental Alienation Theory and the Journal of Family Trauma, Child Custody, and Child Development. So what's different about this article is this research is it only pertains to false information that has some connection to this specific journal. In other words, previously, we had about 30 or 40 journals where those examples came from. And what we want to do now is focus on one journal and see if there's false information in that particular journal. And so we've written this up. Dr. Zhu and I have written this up. It's being considered by a new journal for peer review, and we are hopeful that it will be published in a few months. So this is what happens in this journal. First of all, this is the overview. Remember, I showed you before a diagram similar to that. The previous diagram had 94 examples of the same misinformation, and we found a few more. And so now the new diagram has 110 examples of the same misinformation. The starting point is the same. Over here on the left-hand side, it says would, and the end point is the same. Over here on the right-hand side, it says 2022. So, but there are actually additional examples compared to what we showed you previously. But what we did here, the important thing, what we did here, is we looked for the articles that had some connection to a specific journal. And this is what we found. These articles are only, I think there are about 60 here out of the 110. And these articles all had some connection to the same journal, that the authors of these articles were on the editorial board of that journal, or the authors or the article was actually published by this particular journal. So here, I'll show you what I mean. That if you see here, I think there are about 60 articles here with the same misinformation. And of these, about 17 were published in that journal, and 57 were written by members of the editorial board of the journal. So what journal are we talking about? A particular journal called the Journal of Child Custody. But we think the reason that this happens is the editors of that journal do not like the idea of parental alienation, and they have criticized it for years. And we have to have evidence of what I just said. And so this is an editorial from several years ago by the two editors of that journal. And let's read this, what they said. 30 years after Richard Gardner made up the label of parental alienation syndrome, then they say, without any research or any reasonable definitions, no known mechanisms exist explaining how such indoctrination of children who supposedly have a strong relationship with a parent leads the child to resist or refuse contact with that parent. You know, I think the criticism they're making is, I guess I would call it almost ridiculous. They're saying that we don't have any understanding of the idea that adults or parents can influence their children to think certain things or feel certain things. But it just seems obvious just in everyday life that parents and teachers do this all the time, that parents explain certain things to children and the children adopt the belief system of the parents. And most of the time, that's factual information. You know, for instance, teachers and parents, in a sense, indoctrinate children about mathematics and reading and history and geography. And that's how children learn, that they're told certain things over and over again by parents and teachers. Well, of course, that's how alienating parents indoctrinate children to fear or dislike or reject the other parent. So there's no secret about how that happens. So this is the journal I'm talking about. In other words, this is not a secret. We named this journal in this research that we're doing. It's the Journal of Child Custody, and we know that the editor doesn't like the idea of parental alienation theory, and he has stated that for years. And that's why these articles get published in this journal. This journal actually has a new name now. This is the Journal of Family Trauma, Child Custody, and Child Development, but it's still the same. It has the same editorial policies. So as you can see, this is a pretty provocative article to write. In other words, we're identifying errors that we think have occurred over and over again that have some connection to this journal. That's a pretty bold statement, and but we think it's important to make because we think that it illustrates what we're calling the echo chamber. Misinformation echo chamber is when a group of people who work together or collaborate together share the same ideas. And especially it's a misinformation echo chamber if they share misinformation or if they share false ideas. And we think that's what has happened within the editorial board of this journal, that they all have negative opinions about parental alienation, and they share them. And that's how this misinformation gets propagated from one article to the next to the next. So incidentally, this journal, the publisher of this journal, gives a warning about what's in their journal. This is an interesting statement. This is the disclaimer that is published in every issue of this journal, that this publisher, which is called Taylor and Francis, make no representations whatsoever as to the accuracy, completeness, or suitability for any purpose of the content. In other words, the publishers are saying, you can't trust what it says in this journal. Any opinions and views expressed in this publication are the opinions and views of the authors and are not the views or endorsed by Taylor and Francis. The accuracy of the content should not be relied upon and should be independently verified with primary sources of information. In other words, they're saying the accuracy of the content should not be relied upon. And sure enough, this is the same journal that has published inaccurate or false information about parental alienation theory for years. So let's turn to perhaps a little bit more positive way of looking at this. What can we do about this? This misinformation regarding parental alienation theory and other topics has been going on for 30 or 40 years. What can we do to correct it? Well, now some of these things we've already done. For instance, I told you about an example where my colleagues and I made a formal complaint to the publisher. For instance, one of the publishers was the American Psychological Association, and we made a complaint to them, and they corrected that chapter in that book. Or another thing we can do is publish a rebuttal in the same journal. So I gave you an example of that. There was a journal article, and a couple months later, Dr. Amy Baker and I wrote a new article, and that was published in the same journal. Another thing you can do, it's a big project, is write a book. And I'll give you an example of that. You can do something simpler, which is write a letter to the editor, or what's called an op-ed article. An op-ed article is usually part of the editorial page of a newspaper it's an opinion piece rather than a news story. Or these days, you can make a video. Nowadays, it's much more effective to get your point across by making a good video that might end up on YouTube or on one of the other platforms. And that might be easier to do than writing a whole book, for instance. Other thing you can do is don't try to do this all by yourself. Try to create a campaign in which you join up with other people and together write an article or a book chapter or send a complaint. In other words, and on this one occasion when we complained to a publisher, I think we had close to 100 people sent the same complaint to the publisher. And finally, just as a advice to you on when you're doing your research, don't believe everything you see. In other words, there's a lot of information published about parental alienation that's incorrect. And as you can see, the same incorrect statements get made over and over again. So what you have to do sometimes is go back and look at the original source. Don't look at the secondary source or the tertiary source. Try to go back and look and see what the original source said and see if that's what's now being stated. So those are some ideas. I mentioned the idea of writing a book, so that's what we did. My colleague, Dr. Demosthenes Lorandos, and I wrote this book called Parental Alienation, Science and Law. So this particular book, the entire book is organized around how do you diagnose parental alienation? And in that case, we're talking about the 5-factor model for the identification or diagnosis of parental alienation. So that's used as the platform for this book. But also the second thing this book is about misinformation. So every chapter, at the end of every chapter, there's some examples of misinformation about parental alienation theory and how to contradict it or how to correct it. Here's another book that our colleague Ashish Joshi wrote recently, and this is called Litigating Parental Alienation. He's an attorney, and this is published by the American Bar Association. So that's an important thing to notice. In this, he also talks about misinformation. He put it all in one chapter. There's one chapter in which Ashish talks about different examples of misinformation, and he tries to correct it. So here's something I want to propose. Is it possible for us to have discussion among the people, among people who disagree with each other? In other words, clearly, we are believers in parental alienation theory. Is it possible for us to sit down and have a discussion or some kind of collaboration with people who don't agree with parental alienation theory? Perhaps that would be a good idea. Perhaps we should try to do that. Perhaps if we listen to each other, we can understand each other better, and they can understand us, so there aren't as many misunderstandings or misinformation examples, and we can understand them better. That seems like that would be a good idea. So that has been proposed off and on for several years. And there's this organization in the United States, which some of you may belong to, the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, AFCC, which has promoted this idea of having a search for common ground. In other words, specifically around the people who endorse parental alienation and the people who don't like it. Incidentally, the usual difference opinion are people who really are concerned about parental alienation and other people who are really concerned about domestic violence. Well, both of those are important, but there are some people who go overboard and on one side or the other, and they end up being misinformed. So this is the idea of getting together a meeting, convening a meeting of writers on these two topics who have different perspectives. And we would sit together and have meetings together and try to explain clearly on things that we agree or disagree. We would also try to identify specific research that would sort out the differences. In other words, clearly we're going to have some areas that we disagree on. And if that's the case, is there some way to study the topic? Is there some way to have research that would help explain or help us understand the answer to the disagreements? And also the idea is that this would eventually be published in the journal of this organization, the AFCC journal, which is called Family Court Review. So that seems like a really good idea. Why don't we get these people together and see if there are things we can agree on? And I think there are things we agree on. And this is an example. Here are two basic statements which I think we all agree on. First, a statement about domestic violence. Domestic violence is a serious problem that affects many families, but sometimes there are false allegations of domestic violence. And another statement, parental alienation is a serious problem that affects many families, but sometimes there are false allegations of parental alienation. So we've been proposing for some time that we have this meeting and we see if we can discuss the topics with people that we don't agree with and see if there are some things we can agree on. Well, guess what's happening? This is happening. I'm getting my wish to have this conference or this meeting. And this is a meeting that's coming up in June in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's the big meeting of this organization, the AFCC. And one of the events at this meeting is a discussion about parental alienation. And the discussion involves people that we agree with and we don't agree with. And this is what the discussion looks like. This is actually one of the main sessions. This is what's called a plenary session, in which the entire meeting comes together in one big auditorium. And it's called Depolarizing by Example, AFCC Peace Talks on Parent-Child Contact Problems. So they're called peace talks because this has been a battle. Over the years, there has been a battle and wars going on between different sides the parental alienation side and the domestic violence side. And in this case, we've gotten together over the last few months and we're going to do a presentation together. If any of you happen to be there, if any of you happen to be coming to Boston for this meeting, let me know and we'll get together and we can discuss the situation. But you can look at the participants here. They're myself. I represent parental alienation. And then down below, Peter Jaffe is a psychologist from Canada, and he represents the concern about domestic violence. And then the other people are I guess you would say, interested in the topic, but you might say they're more neutral. Dr. Harris Britt is a psychologist. There's a retired judge, Denise McCauley, and an attorney named Stacy Platt. So those are the people who are going to be part of this session. As I said, let me know if you're going to be in Boston for that meeting and we can get together. So here's one more thought. This is this organization that I'm the president of, the Parental Alienation Study Group. And you're welcome to come to our website, www.pasg.info. And if you want to join the organization, that would be a great idea. You can come to the website and there's a link that says membership, and you can join PASG. So thank you very much for your attention today. I'm going to stop the sharing, I think, because we don't need this PowerPoint anymore. And
well, thank you, Mr. Barnet, for your presentation and on the misinformation circulating and being perpetrated and what actions we can take to tackle that. We have a couple of questions, 3 questions from our audience. One is from Ricardo Lima from Mexico, and he has the following question. Dr. Barnet, considering the complexities and controversies associated with parental alienation, particularly in the debate in its recognition in various legal systems, how do you suggest practitioners and legal professionals discern and navigate between genuine cases of parental alienation and the instances where the term might be misused to gain advantage in custody disputes?
Well, of course, people who do evaluations and also judges have to collect information from a variety of sources. And we can do an evaluation. They're fairly elaborate. You, as a starting point, you have to have an open mind. You have to say to yourself, well, this child doesn't want to see the parent. Why? And there are a number of different reasons. You can't assume that it's parental alienation. Maybe it's something else. Maybe the child has a mental disorder like separation anxiety, or maybe the child has some form of autism, or there's some other reason why the child doesn't want to go visit the other parent. But then the actual evaluation consists of a lot of information. You interview one parent, you interview the other parent, you see the child twice. Usually one parent brings the child, and then the other parent brings the child. You do some testing, you collect information from other people, and I think almost always, if you collect enough information carefully, you can tell whether it's alienation or something else. But you have to have certain criteria. So we've published the criteria for how to diagnose parental alienation. And there are 5 things you have to have, and I'll just go through them real quickly. The child has to have contact refusal. The child is saying, I don't want to go see mom or dad. There has to be a previous good relationship, that in the past, that parent who's now being rejected had a good relationship. Thirdly, there has to be an absence of neglect or abuse. In other words, you have to be able to show that the parent who's being rejected is a good parent. In other words, if that parent has been abusive, then the child has a good reason for not wanting to see that parent. Fourth, you have to be able to show alienating behaviors. Those are the behaviors that the alienating parent is doing to indoctrinate the child to be afraid of the other parent. And finally, you have to have certain behaviors in the child. And there are actually 8 of them. We have an article about this that goes through the 5 factors and explains this in greater detail. Well, I'm happy to send that to anybody. If you send me a message, I'm happy to send you the article. It's called the 5-factor model for the diagnosis of parental alienation. So that's what it takes. It takes a lot of work in some cases to figure out whether it's alienation or something else.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from Spain, from Jose Luis Sariego Morillo. And his question is, because earlier at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the UN Human Rights Council. And he says, can we really trust the reports from the UN Human Rights Council?
Well, in most cases, I don't think you can. You see, they hire a consultant. The person who wrote that report, whose name is Reem Assalam, who I think is a PhD psychologist, she is not an employee of the United Nations. She is a consultant, and she's an independent hired person, and they're given an assignment. And in this case, I think she went off the tracks, so to speak, that the original assignment seemed to be about domestic violence, but she went off on this whole different topic of criticizing parental alienation. So, no, I don't think you can trust that report. Maybe there are, obviously the Human Rights Council is a huge committee and they deal with many, many really, really serious things that are happening in the world. And so hopefully in most situations, they know what they're doing and they're correct. But in that particular situation, the report was not correct.
Thank you very much. And this is the last question from Maria from Puerto Rico. What is the difference between parental alienation and parental estrangement?
Well, of course, that's an important thing to know. In alienation, the child rejects a parent because they've been indoctrinated. The parent A indoctrinates the child to reject parent B. And so it's not for a good reason. It's for a made up reason. In estrangement, the child rejects parent B for a good reason, meaning that, he or she is not a good parent. Maybe that parent has been abusive or neglectful, or simply has really, really poor parenting skills. So there's a good reason why the child doesn't want to go have time with that parent, and that's called estrangement. And alienation is there's not a good reason other than the indoctrination. So these terms have been in use now for almost 20 years. And now people over and over again have used these alienation and estrangement again, and they use the definitions over and over again. So I think that nowadays almost everybody who works in this field uses alienation and estrangement in that way.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, for your presentation, and for being with us. We're really honored to have you, and we hope we can have you in future webinars and conferences. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you so much.